begin with the session 3, and this is all about LASIK and femto-LASIK. The chairperson for this session, Dr. Kumar, Dr. Y.L. Rajshekhar, Dr. R.P. Singh, Dr. Shashi Kapoor, and Dr. Anand, Dr. Ananta, and Dr. Shamat would be moderating. So we have talks on microkeratome, LASIK and femto-LASIK, customized ablation and LASIK, and presbyopic lasers. So all to the chair, and
Hi, good afternoon all. Hi Sonu.
Hi.
I'm looking forward to a very nice and interesting session.
Anand, just a second. I would request the AV team to please take on Dr. Kumar as the chair. I think he has logged on through the audience. AV team. Can we have Dr. Kumar on the chair?
Now is in panelist.
Yeah, so please upgrade him to a panel. Dr. Kumar, welcome here.
Sonu,
yes, Anand, please.
AV team to send links to the two international speakers, Dr. Sekundo and Dr. Jodh Mehta.
AV team, please take care of this. You can WhatsApp Dr. Kudlu the links and it will be immediately sent to them. They want on their WhatsApp, please.
All right.
Yeah, please start.
Okay. All right. So we have a very important part of the session in terms of going from the basics to the advanced. And we will start with microkeratomes in this session. So I would request speakers definitely to stick to time. We are behind by about 10 to 15 minutes. So let us hope for a very nice and knowledgeable session. I'll request Dr. Kumar to give his comments before we introduce the first set of speakers.
Thanks, Anand. Welcome, everybody. We start fast because we are running late. I invite the first speaker, Dr. Karishma Wadia, who's a fantastic refractive surgeon and who will give an overview on microkeratomes that's there available in the market today. Over to you. Let's also so that we can finish this session on time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me here. Am I audible and are my slides visible?
Yes, yes.
All right. So I'm going to be speaking about a current overview of microkeratomes. I have no financial interests. Okay, so let's begin with the principle itself. In a microkeratome, the oscillating blade which docks to a suction ring that ultimately helps us create the lamellar corneal flap when the cornea is held under pressure. And a typical components of a microkeratome system, whatever company it may be of, will have your console, motor, microkeratome head into which your blade is mounted, applanator lenses for you to check whether the pressure is adequate, vacuum fixation, a flap stop ring, and a foot switch, of course. This is what the different types of consoles look like based on the companies available in the market. There's a Moria, there's a Hansatome, there's an ML7, so on and so forth. And these are the motor and the microkeratome heads. Now, this is one of the most important parts of your assembly because this motor of the keratome is going to initiate the forward movement of your head and cause the oscillation of the blade, which ultimately creates your cut. So the modalities of microkeratome pass are of mainly two. One is a rotational or a pivoting flap. The advantage of this is that lesser space is needed supposedly, and the hinge placement can be variable. But the disadvantage is that the flap is thick, thin and thick because of the upward movement or the rotational movement or the pendular movement of the head. Typical examples of these would be Hansatome for the rotational movement and Carriazo for a pendular movement. Now, of these two, I have personal experience with the Hansatome, but I have never used the Carriazo. In a linear flap, on the other hand, there is great intra-op visibility during flap creation. There's a planar flap profile, but the disadvantage is that you are going to get a fixed hinge position, which is typically going to be nasal. And a bigger advantage that I feel, having used both the Amadeus and the SBK, is that the learning curve is very less. So for beginners, I would recommend a linear flap creation would always be a better choice. These are the types of heads that you have, again, based on whether your head is vertical or horizontal. That's how it will be placed, and that is what is going to obscure your visibility or otherwise make it more clear. Suction ring is what will induce your rise in IOP. So the first step is always choosing the correct size of your suction ring, and that diameter is what will determine how much of your cornea will protrude into your microkeratome, which will help you determine your flap diameter. For this, it is always recommended that you follow the nomogram of the microkeratome that you are using so as to avoid mishaps. Having said that, if you are used to a particular system, because every company will have a newer and a newer nomogram every year that goes by. So if you are comfortable with your previous settings, then try to stick to them. Vacuum settings are very important. Again, when your machine is new, there will be a certain vacuum setting that is recommended by the company. And as you keep using and going on, the oscillation speed, the rotational movements can be changed as per your requirements. The placement of your suction ring, however it may be, is most important. You need to make sure that there is adequate scleral exposure on superior and inferior sides. You need to make sure that your IOP has been adequately achieved, which you can do with the help of a Baraka tonometer. My practical tips for the microkeratome, the most important message would be to briefly explain the procedure to the patient. This takes away half your trouble because the patient knows what to expect. Otherwise, there's a certain amount of anxiety during the surgery. And what I feel the most common mishap that can happen during a microkeratome LASIK is that when the oscillating blade starts moving, there's a vibrational sound and a movement that occurs, during which the patient tends to flinch or squeeze his eyes, and that's very often the time when you may actually lose your suction. So if you can just sit down for a few minutes before the procedure and talk the patient through the procedure, it solves your problem. Another practical tip that I advise for any microkeratome that you may be using is always assemble and inspect before you have started your procedure. Check the suction before each patient. Always do a trial pass before you actually do the procedure. And a very important message is to listen to the sound of the blade oscillation. So even if you are not doing the trial pass yourself, just hearing the sound, sometimes you can come to know that something is amiss. That means maybe you have to remount the blade or check the blade and look for something that's not right. Another tip that I was given by one of my mentors was to always do a marking on the cornea. Now, during my fellowship, when I did a humongous amount of cases, we never used a marking, but when I went into private practice, I was advised to do so. And out of 100 cases, you may just have one flap-related complication, but this marking will save you the trauma that that complication is going to cause to you. So I do advise to make a marking as well. The advantages of a mechanical microkeratome are the proven history, of course, the fact that it's being used for so many years. In this day and age, it still is the lower costly procedure as compared to femtosecond and SMILE. The process in general is shorter because of the fact that the flow of making the flap is going to be less than 30 seconds. And we must not forget that this can be very easily used to create a flap in an anterior stromal opacity or a scar. Of course, this also produces lesser inflammation. Now, coming to a few studies, this is a very interesting study about flap thickness variation with 3 types of microkeratome heads, where they compared the 1-use plus SPK, the M290 and the M2110, and it showed that the SPK demonstrated the most accurate flap thickness. There is a Cochrane study which has compared mechanical microkeratome to femtosecond LASIK, which shows that there is no difference in visual acuity, which we are pretty much aware of, but that dry eyes is more associated with microkeratome and DLK because of the inflammation is more associated with femto-LASIK. There is another study, which is again very interesting, which compares the flap thickness in 6 different microkeratome models. And the conclusion is that there is variability in all models. So there's no one gold standard or universal standard that you can say that this is the best microkeratome. It will all depend on your learning curve and how comfortable you are with that machine. Device labeling did not represent the flap thickness. So just because your the head says that it's going to cut 90 microns or 110 microns, it may not do so. Initially, if you are a first timer, it is imperative that you do an anterior segment OCT to see what kind of flap thicknesses you are achieving, because the amount of pressure you apply will also determine your flap thickness. Also, thinner corneas had thinner flaps. Similarly, for thicker corneas, there were thicker flaps. And the first cut in the first eye of a bilateral procedure usually has a thicker flap. There is my own study, of course, in the Journal of Refractive Surgery with my team from Narayan Nethralaya, in which we have shown that there is definitely more flap predictability in a femtosecond when it was measured with a bioptogen. I just have a small video which I would like to play. How do I end this screen sharing? Are you able to see my screen? Are you able to see the video?
Yes, the video we can't see. We are seeing a thank you.
Okay. 1 second. Yes. All right. So is the video playing now?
Yes, yes.
Yes. So I would, after making a marking, we'd always like to dry up the bed. Make sure that there is adequate scleral exposure both superiorly and inferiorly, so that when you place your ring, you are achieving a good suction. Make sure that there are no eyelashes in the way. You can mount the head on the suction ring or do that separately. I prefer to do it separately. In this video, it's been shown mounted already. Pass line. The flap is created within a jiffy, and so that's all for me. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Karishma.
Thank you.
Thank
It
you.
was a very
Karishma.
insightful talk.
I hope the other chairpersons are here. Everybody is here. Dr. Rajendra Singh, Dr. Rajshekhar, everybody is here.
Everybody is here. Yes, sir.
Great. I would invite the next speaker now, Dr. Virendra Agarwal. So we saw how perfectly flaps are made, and he will tell us about complications. And the next speaker after that would be about infections. But it's only one point that you made was correct, that even I do manual whenever we do microkeratome LASIK, I prefer to mark. But the mark, as you showed in your diagram, is para-radial. So that's one important point.
Yes, so that's another, yes, thank you for bringing that up. There are different types of marking that you do. So usually I make a V superiorly and one line temporally. But yeah, in this particular video, yes, I've made one on 180 degrees opposite. So yes.
Excellent. Dr. Virendra Agarwal, who's a brilliant refractive surgeon, everyone knows him, needs absolutely no introduction. Over to you, Virendra.
So before you
Thank you, Dr. Kumar.
Before you could
Yes.
start, Dr. Virendra, I just want to make sure if Dr. Shilpa knows that next session is going to be hers, Dr. Shilpa Das.
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Dr. Virendra Agarwal, you may go ahead. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Can you hear me, Dr. Kumar?
Yes, yes. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for keeping me in this session and sharing complications happening with the microkeratome. We are lucky now that we are not getting enough complications, but definitely the complications are the part of surgery and they can be there with the same microkeratome also. I was trying to have the virtual background, but there was some problem, so I'm not using that virtual background. Please pardon me for that. I don't have any financial disclosure for this talk. However, the complications whenever happen, they actually cause more of a problem rather than financial benefits. And you're not able to sleep, you're not able to eat, and have a lot of tensions. And sometimes, unfortunately, you may end up with having consumer protection issues. The common complications are the buttonhole, the free cap, thin cap, irregular or torn flap, corneal perforation, which is rare, and I think it is only reported in literature. Epithelial defects, limbal bleeding, interface debris may be left over at the end of the surgery. These are the intraoperative one. The postoperative one can be DLK and microbial keratitis. As you have heard the first talk that the keratomes have improved a lot, but initially definitely there were some issues. So I will just like to give a warn that people, whenever they feel that the corneas are not normal, rather than doing LASIK, you can have other options of refractive surgery, which may be a surface ablation, femtolaser, or implants of the ICL or phakic lens. So whenever these conditions are there where you feel the complication can happen, better to avoid to create a microkeratome flat. The common conditions are the flat cornea, stiff cornea, very thick cornea, deep set eyes, small pupil aperture, very anxious patients who are not allowing to have a suction. If you are losing suction again and again, and if your suction is not achieved as the parameter, because every keratome have a parameter in which once the suction is achieved, then only you should start the path. Always do some preventive checkups. They are very, very important. Always inspect the blade, even if it is a new, because sometimes there can be a defective blade. Always do dry run of microkeratome in the ring. Backward and forward movement should be very smooth. This can avoid the complications. And reuse of the blade, though sometimes it is required and some people do it, but it may have a set of complications, so prefer not to use it. Always follow the nomograms for making the flap. Don't use your sixth sense that in this case, though it is looking very abnormal cornea in sense of a very small, deep set eye, very thin cornea, very flat cornea, but I'll be able to do with my experience. These are the things not to be done because we are doing surgery on the normal eyes. And option can be chosen like femtosecond laser or the surface ablation. Intraoperative complications related to the microkeratome are reported in various ranges from 0.03 to 2.6. This is the picture I have taken from net from courtesy Dr. Nitesh, that whenever you are passing through, you can have a flap buttonhole. You can see a large buttonhole in the center, and this is because of the buckling of the cornea when you are applying vacuum and passing on the keratome. This is also not very common nowadays, but this has been there in my initial days. 3 cases I had, and now we are not having them last for 10-15 years. But this is common with the steep cornea. Loss of suction can be there because of the loose epithelium or loose cornea, or there was some problem in the microcrotum itself. The defective blade may be one reason, and the poor blade quality, as I said, the inspection of the blade is required because sometimes the edges are chipped off, and because of that also you can have this kind of situation. See, steep cornea, just to show the picture. Whatever happens, what you can do is that, should we do laser or not to do? Because there is a large buttonhole in the center itself, you can't do the laser because it will not achieve the refractive correction the way you want. So it should not be done. The risk of epithelium ingrowth is very high because it is difficult to realign the buttonhole flap in a very perfect manner. But meticulous cleaning and meticulous approximation can prevent it. The risk of other complications, BL can melt, is there. Irregular astigmatism can be created because of this. So before doing any further laser ablation, be sure that it should get stabilized. It is not enough, and it is correctable by laser. Otherwise, avoid this surgery in the future also. Some of the patients can be taken up after 3 months for this. But the buttonhole on the table itself should be meticulously cleaned, and approximation should be done. And the flap should be adhered. It should be made sure. These kind of flaps are not like a normal flaps where you can just do a 1 minute or 2 minutes watch and they are enough. You require to give more time for STRIA test, and it should be done repeatedly. And you can use the buttonhole, you can use the BCL in case of buttonhole or complications related to the flap. The another complication, which is common one, the free cap. It is the flap which is created in which the flap created was smaller than before the hinge it stops or it completes. So because of this, there is a free cap. You have a cap which is separated, not attached to the cornea by the hinge. In these cases, the laser can be done if it is of adequate size. Again, the causes are mainly the defective blade. Wide to wide, this diameter of the cornea is having a mismatch with the suction ring. And sometimes because the sclera is also too flat, the suction achieved is not enough, and you can have a free cap. Common with the flat corneas, and it can be common with the sometimes rarely with the very steep corneas also. The laser ablation can be done if it is having enough ablation zone, and luckily now the laser ablation is done in a very limited zone. The optical zone 6 and the transition zone is around 1 to 2 millimeter maximum in the majority of the machines. Initially, it was there with a large optical zone and a large transition zone. So the laser ablation can be done if you feel that it is to be done only in the bed, not on the epithelium of the remaining area. The preoperative marking is very helpful in approximation at the end of the surgery. So whenever you are in doubt, you can use definitely the marking. As the previous speaker says that the marking is of big help in all patients, but gradually we give up and we don't do because we have done many cases. So we feel it is an unnecessary step, but definitely it is a big savior in these situations. Whenever there is a free flap, keep them flap in the anti-desiccation chamber to avoid drying. Otherwise, it will be difficult to replace. And orient the flap properly that the epithelium should be above on the surface, anti-surface, and the stroma should be adhered to the stroma. If rarely the flap is lost and it is of enough size, then ablation can be done and you have to apply the bandage control lens. Sometimes the flaps are too thin, and nowadays we are planning to make thin flaps, but thin flap means around 100 micron, not less than that, because with the microcroton flap, if you make further thin, the center, because it is a meniscus flap, the central part is too thin and it is difficult to handle and manipulate. And sometimes it can give just STRIA because of that. Though in myopic patients, it may be an advantage to maintain the remaining stroma in enough size. So incorrect size or parameter not following is the main reason of having these kind of things. Incomplete or torn flap, the pictures can be like this. I have one video to share. That this video is of an incomplete flap and torn flap. Luckily, not mine case. I received this patient from my friend that he said the patient was very uncooperative, and at the end he could not have enough good size of the flap. So he stopped the procedure. He didn't do a laser ablation. You can see a teeth-like, tongue-like structure, triangular, which is not actually cut, and the rest of the flap is cut. And next day when we received the patient, there was a lot of epithelial problem issues also. This is all loose epithelium, you can see. So we scraped off this all loose epithelium. We scraped off the epithelium around the area of the cut also to prevent the epithelial ingrowth. And that is how we can prevent the ingrowth complication. And this flap was reposited along with the triangular flap very well. And we avoided laser doing in this case. At the end, BCL was applied.
I'm really sorry to be interruptive. Dr. Virendra, I request you to please conclude quickly.
Yeah.
The time is
So
up.
I will just complete. These are the common complications, but these all common complications can be avoided if you use the keratome in a proper manner. Means you should check them before, do a dry run, and if you do a meticulous cleaning of the flap and other things, then the postoperative complication can also be avoided. So dry run is a very, very important. Only do a keratome flap making only in cases which are very fit. So my cutoff is 41 to 46. If the corneas are more stiff than that, I don't do keratome nowadays, and less than 41 also I don't use. With the Moria, we initially did even 40K also, but with 40K, there are some chances that the flap may not be very good. So I'm avoiding nowadays.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, doctor. That was a wonderful talk.
Thank you, Dr. Virendra Agarwal, for that wonderful talk. I think our audience would benefit from your experience. Dr. Virendra Agarwal is a senior most phaco-refractive surgeon in the state of Rajasthan. He's the leading and the pioneer in refractive surgery in our state, and great stalwart nationally. Thank you, Dr. Virendra, for that wonderful talk and for being with us. So now we have Dr. Shilpa Das, and she'll be talking on managing post-LASIK infections. All to you.
Before Dr. Shilpa starts, I'd like to remind Dr. Chekitan Singh. Sir, you're going to be next. I hope you're all prepared for your talk. Over to you, Dr. Shilpa. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. I'm ready.
Thank you. Very good afternoon to one and all. This is Dr. Shilpa from Narayan Nethralaya, Bangalore. Today I will be discussing a rare but very important topic, that is post-LASIK infections. I will be taking you through its epidemiology, microbiological spectrum, diagnosis, and the management strategies. So let us look at the incidence of these infections. They are relatively rare, especially compared to PRK. The reported incidences are between 0 and 1.5%. There are some groups that have reported that after the addition of moxifloxacin in their post-operative drug regimen, the incidence has further reduced. PRK having large epithelial defects, and use of bandage contact lenses, the incidence is known to be 5 to 6 times higher in different studies. The infection after the LASIK surgery can have an onset within 1 week or beyond 1 week, when it is called early and late onset respectively. Now, gram-positive cocci are the most common organisms, that is staphylococci, and among the late onset infections, it is atypical mycobacteria. Now, these are notorious to they are known to cause outbreaks post-LASIK due to suboptimal pre-surgical preparation, multiple use of microkeratome blades, or use of contaminated water. So these are some of the reasons such kind of outbreaks are seen. Most of the keratitis manifest as interface infiltrates. The other types of presentations being those restricted to the lamellar flap or stroma, a surface ulceration, and sometimes rarely endophthalmitis. So this is a case of post-LASIK interface infectious keratitis caused by filamentous fungi. Here you can see multiple patchy irregular infiltrates in all inside the flap interface and quite a bit of flap edema. There can be other kind of presentations like a ring infiltrate. You can see a very small haze initially which later spreads, or multiple dot-like infiltrates like this. Now, the American Academy of Ophthalmology preferred practice patterns has set out guidelines on how to manage these infections. That is, which antibiotic would you choose? The medical management is the first line of management when you're tackling these infections. Now, in agreement with this is the ASCRS white paper that was published in 2005 that suggests that the infection onset, if it is 2 weeks or less, the drugs of choice would be 4th generation fluoroquinolones along with cefazolin or vancomycin. And if it is more than 2 weeks, it would be alternating with amikacin. Now, the preparation of fortified antibiotics is something that all of us should know because these antibiotics are known to be higher in concentration. Therefore, they are typically known to be more effective than the normal antibiotics, that all types, that is the 4th generation fluoroquinolones or any other antibiotic. The concentrations are as follows. Vancomycin and cefazolin should be constituted to 5%. Amikacin is 2.5%. Now, among the antifungals, the natamycin is available as a suspension of 5%, whereas Ampho B as well as voriconazole have to be reconstituted to a strength of 0.15% and 1% respectively. So how do we manage these cases? Now, once we see the signs and symptoms suspicious of infectious keratitis, the first step is to scrape the lesion. Why this is important is because the microbiology investigation is very important to tell us what the organism is before we go on to the treatment. In case of LASIK, lift the flap and scrape the stromal bed. Sometimes you would want to scrape the underside of the flap also to get the material and send it for microbiology, which I'll be discussing subsequently. Now, do not wait for the microbiological results to come. If the infection occurs within 1 week, start off on fortified vancomycin along with moxifloxacin. And if it is more than 1 week, start off with fortified amikacin along with moxifloxacin. This is because amikacin is the drug of choice for atypical mycobacteria as well as nocardia, which is more common after 1 week of LASIK. Among the microbiological workup, we have the staining techniques, that is gram stain, KOH mount, Ziel-Nielsen stain for these acid-fast bacilli. And among the culture techniques, blood agar, chocolate agar, sabrodextrose agar, to name a few. What we can see in the extreme right of this slide are the biochemical tests and the disc diffusion antibiotic sensitivity tests that is done to find out which antibiotics is sensitive to this organism. This is the most important test that is to be done to find out our drug of choice. If none of these tests are positive, we can also go for a PCR test. So this is how some common bugs look like. Staphylococci are gram-positive round elements in groups, whereas mycobacteria are slender, beaded, non-branching structures. So if the microbiological investigation is positive, treat as per the protocol and have a close follow-up. If it is negative, continue the primary therapy that I spoke about, but you need to change the drug regimen based on the clinical picture if it is worsening. Definitely, you should rescrape if possible. Options in case of non-responsiveness to therapy, progressive ulceration or flap necrosis are many. We'll be discussing these surgical modalities. Now, when would you do what? So which one to choose? If the infection is not resolving with topical medications, you can do a flap lift and irrigation with antibiotics. If there is a complete flap necrosis, you need to do a flap amputation. If there is a thinning, impending perforation or small or frank perforation, then you need to do a cyanoacrylate glue plus a bandage contact lens. Now, sparingly used in early cases is Pac-CHZ that is shown to be effective in very few case reports. Therapeutic penetrating keratoplasty is reserved for large infiltrates with extensive melt, limbal involvement and intraocular spread. The resolution usually takes a couple of weeks or months. About 50 to 75% resolves with a best corrected visual acuity of 20/40 or better. And infections with gram-positive bacteria seem to fare better than the rest. Now, as the saying goes, prevention is always better than cure. So what can we do pre-operatively to prevent these infections? Rule out dry eye, rule out any other kind of corneal or conjunctival infection, blepharitis, MGD. If they are present, they need to be managed appropriately before the surgery. Also rule out ocular surface diseases. During surgery, the tissue handling should be minimal. Adequate sterility through adequate preparation of the ocular adnexia with 10% povidone iodine, using disposable gloves, a 3-monthly quality checkup of the autoclave units, and using pure and contaminant-free water to clean the instruments is very important. And post-surgery, if there are any epithelial defects, bandage contact lens to be used, along with reduction in the use of topical corticosteroids in these cases until the epithelial defects heals, and a regular follow-up on day 1, day 7, day 30. At each look, we should look for presence of any epithelial defects or any signs of infection. So to summarize, infection post-LASIK is a rare but serious complication. Taking preventive steps reduces its occurrence, and a high index of clinical suspicion is required for its early recognition. Microbiological investigations are very, very important to treat with sensitive drugs. Surgical management is required in non-responding and severe cases. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shilpa. Moving on to our next speaker.
Yes, Sonu?
We'll go on to the next session on LASIK and femto LASIK as well. So I would request if Dr. Rajshekar or Dr. RP Singh have joined the session, I would really request some input from them.
I think Anand, they are not seen. They can start, the others can start. Yeah, Cyrus.
Yeah.
Are you next, Dr. Dr. Singh is. I think
please go ahead, sir. Yeah. And Dr. Cyrus, you are next, so just keep it.
Yes, sir, I am ready. So shall I start?
Yes,
Yes,
please go
please.
ahead.
Sure.
So I'll mute myself.
So can everybody see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes, yes, yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. I wish to thank the IIOS Scientific Committee and Dr. Krishna Prasad and everybody in the refractive course, who have given me an opportunity to share my experience and outcomes of refractive surgery with a double frequency laser. There are no financial disclosures or conflict of interest. Now, among the plethora of so many lasers around, why I chose Zeiss, as it is more than 170-year-old company. It's a world leader in optics, manufactures microscopes, fundus cameras, lenses, lasers, LASIKs, and even semiconductors, which I didn't know that. One of the oldest existing optics manufacturers in the world, has worldwide presence. We have an association in our hospital and trust on Zeiss since more than past 25 years. Stands for impeccable quality, value, and things which are built to last. My wish list for a refractive platform were cutting edge technology, which should be clinically relevant, the best optics in business, easy to use, intuitive interface, less recurring cost, sturdy, and have excellent service backup. So there was a plethora of machines which were available in the market, and I am happy that when you compare these on all the parameters, the Zeiss MEL 90 matches them and even outshines most of them in all the parameters like fast eye tracker, Gaussian beam profile, flying spot, giving you an option of topo guided treatment, presbyopic correction, and a femtosecond link. So the clinically relevant features which I really admire, one of the unique selling propositions for this machine for me has been, for the MEL 90 has been FlexiQuence, which is my ability to choose 250 Hertz or 500 Hertz laser for the kind of procedures which I want to do. It has an advanced ablation algorithm, an ultra fast ablation speed of 1.3 seconds per diopter, a patented adaptive plume removal system, topo guided LASIK and presbyon capability, fast and hassle-free gas exchange, no nitrogen generators, no other cylinders. And in my past 5 years experience, I have not had a single breakdown in which I had to call in Zeiss and stop my procedures. My preferred range of correction is 8 to 9 diopters myopia, 5 diopters hyperopia, and up to 5 diopters of astigmatism. The unique feature of FlexiQuence gives me a very fast laser for performing standard LASIK, and also gives me 250 Hertz laser for making a gentle treatment on the surface. That is, when I do PRK, I switch to 250 Hertz. That has been postulated to cause less heating of the surface compared to 500 Hertz. And the less the heating, the less the haze, and the better results and prediction in your overall accuracy. Advanced ablation algorithm stands for a combination of tissue saving algorithm and an aspherical optimized algorithm, which is one profile which fits all and gives you the complete treatment range. We all know that cyclotorsion can affect our outcomes. For astigmatism greater than 2 diopters, even a 5 to 6 degree rotation of the patient's head or cyclotorsion of the eye can give you around a surprise or under and over correction of 0.5 diopters of astigmatism. So there are two ways of correcting cyclotorsion in MEL 90. One is the automated system with the Z-align, or a manual marking with the bubble marker, which I do like we do for our toric IOLs. You mark it manually, And this is just a schematic to show you this is the eye. And these are the marks which were horizontal when the patient was sitting down. I marked it with a bubble marker. When the patient lies down, there is some amount of cyclotorsion. So with this particular machine in the software, you have a tab called a zero line. When you press that before you treat, it shows you a horizontal red line onto the corneal surface. And then you can manually rotate the patient's head to align these marks, which you had made with the bubble marker with the zero line. When you do that, and when you subsequently treat, the results are really gratifying. I have found very little under or over correction and astigmatism with that. Extremely accurate. And it is already published that manual limbal markings and iris resistance software are equally effective and safe in LASIK. Our experience and results with the MEL 90 have been, we have treated 850 eyes. This is partial records from our center. 51% were males. Mean age was 22 years. A staggering 98.5% of the patients were satisfied with LASIK and 96% with PRK. We did around 41% PRK procedures and 59% SBK LASIK. As I started, this percentage was around 80% LASIK and 20% PRK, but over the 4 to 5 years, I have switched more and more to PRK. So PRK is my go-to procedure now. And slowly I'm developing more and more confidence as I find it to be extremely good in terms of results, safety, and predictability. My correction rays has been from 0.5 to 11 diopters and plus 0.5 to plus 5 diopters hyperopia and 0.25 diopter cylinder to 5 diopter cylinders. Our experience, final uncorrected visual acuities, 96% of the total patients achieved UCV of 6/6. 99% in LASIK patients were 6/6 and 92% in PRK patients. This compares very favorably with the data which Dr. Praveen had also mentioned, the LVPI data, 93% patients who were uncorrected visual acuity of 6/6. Our experience with the Moria SBK 1 use plus microkeratome has also been very, very rewarding. From day one, I have only done SBK LASIK, 100 micron flaps, which compared to your femto flaps, have made flaps without complications ranging from 40 to 47K. It has a disposable head with blade, which eliminates risk and cost of re-sterilization. Very good flap edges, no DLK, no epithelial ingrowths. Visually insignificant microstri are definitely observed because the flaps are thin. Flap-related complications have been very low to just 1%. My take-home message is invest wisely, especially in post-COVID scenario. PRK has a bright future in my refractive case preferences, and I think soon it will only be PRK and SMILE, which will be there. Flaps will go because you have these both extremes to tackle, and you have very good predictability in both. Zeiss has the most comprehensive and upgradable refractive platforms as of today. You will have to price your refractive procedures in these times attractively. Excellent results and commitment to quality alone triumphs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chekitan Singh.
Thank you.
That was really wonderful. Dr. Kumar, can we?
Yes, so that was excellent, Dr. Singh. I mean, yes, we know that Zeiss is into this for a long time. Yes, we have all different platforms, and now I'd like to invite Dr. Cyrus to talk on different femtolasers as a flap making device. Cyrus
Hi,
is hi,
can you hear me?
Cyrus. Yes, we can hear you. Is now much
Hi,
into
Sonu.
bodybuilding. Sonu, if you don't know that, he's developed 6 packs. So he's besides biking, he's also doing bodybuilding.
I
Cyrus,
know Cyrus is
Hi,
wonderful.
Sonu.
Cyrus, welcome you, and great to have you with us.
Thank you. You can see my slide. Shall I start?
Yeah,
yes, please.
all to you.
So I was given this topic, different femtolasers as flap making devices. So basically, you know, in 8 minutes, it's very difficult to compare every single laser on the market. So we'll just do a quick comparison of Zeiss, Zima, Alcon, and AMO, and let's see which one we should buy. So I'm not a paid consultant to Zeiss or Zima or anyone else, even though I would like to be. So let Zeiss present its case first. Okay, so I called up Zeiss, I called up AMO, I called up Zima, and I said, okay, you send me all your data and let's see which one looks better. AMO never responded, so gone. But Zeiss and Zima responded, so that's what we got. Zeiss claims and backs with data that their system has certain advantages, Of course, they have their company slide saying that everything is wonderful and everything is very good. But let's have a look at each of these claims. For example, it says very high visual acuity. I don't see how much difference that actually makes in a femto laser, but anyway, let's examine each of these claims. So patients who underwent VisuMax flap creation have a clear preference for the VisuMax. Of course, this study was carried out by Zeiss. So if you ask a company for its slides, they are going to give you these slides. However, what you can see, if you can see my cursor, is that with the old intralace system, like with the old femto systems, visual blackout during flap creation was a reality, and a lot of patients did get some subconjunctival hemorrhage because the IOP used to go up very high. So all the new systems don't have that problem. Let's have a look. One more company slide which says that the VisuMax MEL combination is much faster than Alcon's. This was Dan Reinstein's study. And naturally, if you have a company-sponsored study, it's going to show it's faster. In reality, the difference is 10 seconds or 15 seconds, which is neither here nor there. This is an important point. The Zeiss system has got a fixation light inside. So in keratorefractive surgery, the ideal physiologic centration point is the corneal intercept of the visual axis. So the VisuMax will center the flap better on the corneal vertex because it doesn't have any blackout. Opaque bubble layer is the accumulation of gas bubbles temporarily detained in intrastromal interface. So if you have OBL, you can't do a proper exam after that because you won't get a proper pupil tracking. And this is one good thing where VisuMax has the minimum OBL, just like Zima, while Alcon and Intralace are old technologies and they have a huge amount of OBL here. So in summary, the thin flap LASIK with Zima and VisuMax had faster visual recovery because of smoothness of the optical interface. Can you all hear me?
Yes, yes.
Now,
Yes, you can. Yeah. You can hear me, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yes. Okay. So basically all new femtosecond lasers will give you a smoother interface than the old femtosecond lasers. This is nothing fantastic or surprising. If you see an iPhone 12 and you compare it to an iPhone 5, and then it's going to be better and everything is going to be better in that. So that's the progress of technology. This is an important point that the VisuMax has the lowest increase of intraocular pressure as compared to the Intralace and the Zima. Because again, their technology is a little different and it uses that fixation light. Now, Zeiss says, of course, his system is better, and let have Zima has its day in the market. So Zima feels the system is superior because first of all, one system does everything: cornea, cataract, and now lenticule extraction. Basically, their USP is that instead of using microjoules, as you see here, they are using nanojoules. And that's why there is less energy in the eye, so the visual recovery is faster. I have used the Zima system and they had left it for a demo. It was quite nice and user-friendly. And their focal length is less than 1 centimeter, while Zeiss is about 10 centimeters. So that's why they have higher energy in Zeiss, and you can use less energy in the Zima system. Of course, if you see Zima's company slide, it finds that Zima is definitely better, etc. And they say that they have a low incidence of vacuum loss. That is true, because if you articulate that arm onto the eye, the chance of vacuum loss is really low as compared to the other systems. And it's the smallest. Now, basically, now in conclusion, what you have to see is that the era of microkeratome LASIK is basically over. The only reason why we are whipping it to death in India is because people don't want to pay. If everybody came and was ready to pay 1.2 lakhs, there would be no more microkeratomes and they would go into extinction like dinosaur or those old diesel powered cars with black smoke coming out from behind. It still goes on and on, not because patients can't afford, they can afford all kinds of other things. It's because they don't feel it adds value to the procedure. Price is only one part of the expense of buying a femtosecond system. Once you buy it, then there's a huge running cost where you have to keep buying the consumables and the interface. And then after 3 years, there is a ridiculous maintenance contract that the company will stick you with. It's like buying a car for 2 crores and then every year you have to spend 30 lakhs to maintain the car. It's better to throw it away. So this is something that companies have to get their act together. Their maintenance contracts are quite frankly ridiculous. Otherwise, it's all splitting hairs. Whether the flap is ready in 5 seconds here or there makes no difference to the doctor or the patient. Remember, no company is going to claim that their laser is inferior. Every company will maximize their presentation to their benefits. And unlike a phaco machine, we cannot buy 5 different femto flap lasers and decide which one works better. It's better to buy one, in my opinion, that makes flaps, does lens extraction, lenticule extraction. It's small and portable, and most importantly for us, cheaper to buy and run in the long run. So I am done with my presentation.
Nice, Cyrus, very practical as always. In terms of experience, definitely it's almost impossible to have experience on all femto platforms, and most surgeons would be comfortable doing what they have been trained during fellowship to do. And of course, you can pick up new femto platforms, but always the question is in terms of a cost-benefit ratio. And final piece, the proof of the pudding is in the visual acuity and safety. I think these two are very important points. Kumar, would you like to add anything else?
He's right. I mean, ultimately, it's what works best for you. I have a Zimmer Z4 since 8 years, making flap, impact, and pockets with no issues at all. And he's also right that the Z8 has everything, and it is nano jewel. So it has its pluses and it has its minuses. I think it's ultimately who you get along with as a company for the rest of the contract that you'll have to maintain. So is the contract for Smile. So,
Dr. Shetty, would you introduce the next 2 speakers, please?
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. So we'll be now moving on to the customized ablation and LASIK. So we'll have Dr. Rahil Chaudhary, who will be speaking about topo-guided customization for healthy eyes. When, why, when, and how. Dr. Rahil, are you there? Dr. Rahil?
Otherwise, you can call the next speaker.
Next speaker, yes. Please, I would request
Dr.
the speakers
Rajan?
to keep.
Is Dr. Rajan Gupta available?
Looks like my turn has come earlier than expected.
Okay. Dr. Shreyas Ramurthy. Hello, sir. So Dr. Shreyas is going to be speaking about customized.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. At the outset, I would like to thank the entire scientific committee for having put up this wonderful program and having me over here. So actually, I was expecting 2 previous speakers to be talking on topography guided LASIK, and I was wanting to provide a kind of balanced view about this entire so much talk around Contura guided LASIK and really what works and what doesn't work. So since we haven't had the introduction, I'll quickly run you all through a topo guided laser ablation. The advantage, the obvious advantage which a topography guided laser provides over wavefront guided lasers is that the data captured is not limited by the pupil. It's not a dynamic measurements because the pupil is not involved. It's a static measurement over the cornea. I think Dr. Rajan is also trying to connect, I think.
Yeah, I would request the other speakers and audience to please mute.
Yeah.
You have a video. Request everyone to have the video and the audio off. That will give better bandwidth.
Can I
go ahead, Shreyas?
Yeah, thank you, sir. So, and then there are a lot of measurement points that can be captured, not just from the center, but from the peripheral cornea as well. We have better peripheral data, and it's entirely cornea based, which is where most of the higher order aberrations are present. So the early excitement about topography guided LASIK came from this paper from Doyle Stutling, who did a study for the FDA group, and they showed that almost 40% of patients gained 1 or more lines, which is a phenomenal result when you look at any kind of LASIK procedure. But one thing we had to remember that this topo-guided LASIK, which they did, was not just on all eyes. They had very, very strict criteria. When the refraction, that is the difference between the refraction axis and the measured axis on the topography cylinder, was more than 5 degrees, then they would not take it even the cylinders were high. Essentially, if you had 2 or more diopters of cylinder, even a 5-degree difference, they would discard that patient and go ahead with wavefront optimized. If it was less than 2 diopter, they went only up to 10 degree. But unfortunately, in reality, when we see patients who undergo a subjective refraction and then we look at the axis on our topography, a 5 to 10 degree difference is actually very, very common. And we get a lot of patients where the difference is much more than that. So what do you do about those patients? Do you generally discard Contura altogether or discard any form of topography guided treatment altogether and just stick to wavefront optimized? Then why are we talking so much about this treatment if this is all the difference that we are going to allow? So essentially, let me show you what we are doing here. Contura basically does is a wavefront optimized profile. On top of that, it looks at the corneal higher order aberrations which are treated, and a combination is what you get. So essentially, you saw a 36 micron for wavefront optimized, 6 microns essentially for the higher order aberrations, even in a relatively normal cornea. And this was the 42 for the entire ablation, giving a better, smoother corneal profile. A lot of talk came in after this paper was published by Kanellopoulos, where he said everything, whether it's uncorrected, best corrected, reliability, contrast sensitivity, everything was better in topo-guided LASIK when compared to SMILE. He said that he would go ahead with what he called TMR, that is entirely go ahead with the refraction given by the topolyzer or the topography instrument used in Contura, which is a Placido-based device. But unfortunately, this results which he showed was not mirrored by a number of centers which subsequently studied this, including our own. Let me illustrate that with a case example. When the early excitement of Contura came in, we did a contralateral eye study comparing SMILE and topography guided LASIK, and I'll show you the results of this for this particular patient. You can see here, fairly high cylinder in both eyes, 1.75 and 2.75 in either eye, and we subjected the patient to a randomized control trial where the right eye was SMILE and the left eye was the TMR-based Contura LASIK. So in the TMR, we discard whatever the subjective refraction is. We are correcting the full entire cylinder, which is measured by the topolyzer, and go ahead with the treatment. If you look at the postoperative period, the right eye, which was treated with SMILE, the topography showed 1.3 diopters of cylinder almost. Whereas if you look at the Contura eye, the topography was beautiful, absolutely symmetric, and the astigmatism topo cylinder was only 0.1. But if you look at the refraction, to our surprise, the SMILE eye was 6.6 unaided, and the Contura eye had a 0.75 diopter cylinder. Essentially, from a 180, it went to a 90. So essentially, there was a overcorrection, and which resulted in a residual error and flipping of axis. So even though the topography was much, much better in TMR Contura, the patient was subjectively less happy. And that's really what we are looking at. And subsequently, other papers also came which showed that treating entirely based on the TMR did not make sense, and it gave rise to inferior refractive and visual outcomes than the manifest refraction itself. This is essentially because the final cylindrical correction, I'll just take a minute more. The components are the anterior corneal astigmatism, your higher order aberrations, especially the coma contributing to astigmatism, then the posterior corneal astigmatism, internal corneal astigmatism. The internal astigmatism. So there are various components to which are each of which are contributing to your final correction. So just even the patient's higher order aberrations, if the coma is can actually present as a cylinder in your subjective refraction. If it is the same axis as your anterior corneal cylinder, then the refraction cylinder will actually be higher. If it is in the opposite axis, the refraction cylinder will be lower. So it's time we moved on from just treating on the anterior cornea and use some software like this, which actually integrated the entire components. Forcides is one such example, which we're using routinely now, where essentially you take in the subjective refraction, you're taking in the anterior corneal astigmatism and the higher order aberrations from the topolyzer. You take the posterior corneal astigmatism from the pentacam, and then you do a vector analysis of each of these, where you treat the higher profiles, the taluses, each of the vectors are taken into account, and then you have a final resultant vector, which is finally treated. That particular patient, which I showed you, if we entered the data retrospectively, it gave recommended a correction which was much closer to subjective refraction, essentially because the posterior corneal astigmatism was negating the increase which was being shown by the anterior cornea on the topolyzer. So we have an ongoing study now where we are looking at a contralateral study comparing Forcides with Contura, and so far we are seeing superior and consistent results when we are using this software. So in conclusion, analyze the measured versus subjective refraction that you have. If you're unable to get a proper rationale to why there is a higher astigmatism on measured, better to stick to wavefront optimized. We must remember what the patient sees at the end of the day is the uncorrected visual acuity and not how regular or how green the topography is. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, doctor, for giving us your valuable time and for such an insightful session.
Dr. Kumar, would you like to add, Dr. Shetty, just a couple of minutes because we've gained maybe 5 minutes. So just a couple of quick comments before we go on with the next session.
I think just what you said was excellent. I mean, now you're doing a vector analysis which did not consider the posterior float of the cornea at all. So I have been doing surface, but to the Opticon Keratron Scout. Now that is again a topo kind of a laser. So that may not be as accurate as the new analysis that you guys are doing. Again, the application of this, I don't know whether we should do a topo guided laser for everyone, like you mentioned, above -2 or above a 2 cylinder. Some doctors do this routinely. So above 1.5, they do a topo guided surface treatment or a topo guided LASIK for everybody, irrespective of the high order aberrations. Sometimes I feel that we correcting all the high order aberrations, the brain will not be very happy.
Right.
So we are used to seeing that way, right?
Absolutely.
So sometimes I feel just an aspheric treatment with a larger optical zone will serve all your purposes and will not really be an issue. So this is my thought on it. And the patient is used to it. So even if you do a larger aspherical zone, a larger optical zone with the aspheric treatment, patients are still very happy. So this is my thought on it.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's important that, very important that you don't treat the topography. I feel a lot of times we treat the topography and sometimes you don't really need to treat everything that is on the cornea. For me, I find the wavefront optimized works very well because when you're doing the treatment on the bed, somehow it doesn't match what you get on the cornea. So that's what my experience has been. We can go on next part of the speakers. Is there anything else, Shetty, you'd like to add?
No, sir. Sir, would you still go ahead with wavefront customized for all of your patients? Looking at if you're having a pure a cylinder, would you still advise them?
Yeah, I think you need to look at each scan individually, but I do definitely depend on refraction, just like for my keratoconus when I'm planning treatments, I depend on the manifest refraction. I think that is the real proof of the pudding. Okay, thank you so much.
Let's move on to the next speaker, Dr. Rajan Gupta. I think he's ready. He'll be talking about topo-guided LASIK. Dr. Rajan?
I think there is. We can.
He's not there. Dr. Rajan, are you there?
Yeah, you are there, Rajan.
ज्वाइन विद कंप्यूटर और उनकी आवाज आ रही पर सर को आवाज नहीं आ रही है. ठीक है सर, आप म्यूट कर लीजिए एक मिनट.
Meanwhile, I welcome Dr. Secundo also. I think we'll be introducing you during your talk.
Has Dr. Secundo joined us?
Yeah, he already joined us, Sonu.
Okay. So welcome, Dr. Secundo. We're really sorry for all the trouble logging in. Apologies for the delay.
No problem. No problem. I'm on holiday. I'm relaxed.
I know. You look much fresher. You look much fresh. So, meanwhile, can we have then the next talk? Dr. Kumar, if Dr. Rajan is not...
Is Dr. Rahil available? Dr. Rahil Chaudhary? If Dr. Rahil is not available, can we move on to the presbyopic laser section?
Yeah.
Yeah, is Dr. Mohita...
So let's have the next session on board.
Yeah, we'll be going to the next session on presbyopic. We still needed Dr. Rajan and Dr. Rahil. Since they're not available, I think let's move on to presbyopic laser and then come back.
So
Dr.
we have
Mohita, are you ready with your presentation?
I'm ready.
So, Dr. Hello, welcome, ma'am. So, Dr. Mohita will be speaking about evaluation for a presbyopic LASIK patient.
So we have a young, energetic, refractive surgeon doing a presbyopic corrections. All to you, Mohita. Welcome on board.
Yeah. So good afternoon, everybody. Happy to see everybody here. And I'll be talking today about press by LASIK planning. What I will be talking about more is SupraCore, because that's the platform which I work. Speakers would highlight more about other platforms of press by LASIK. So SupraCore is a platform in which there is a central 3 millimeters bump which is created by laser, and this central 3 millimeters is responsible for near vision, and 3 to 6 millimeters is the area which is responsible for distance vision, and in between we have a smooth transition, which is an improved transition, because of which we hardly have seen any glare and halos, because this is basically like creating a multifocality on the cornea. So these are the supracore bumps of hyperopia and myopia, and as you can see that there is a central steepening which is responsible for the near vision. The principle is that as when we start reading, the pupil constricts and the central 3 millimeters becomes more active. But when we are viewing for distance, our pupil dilates and 3 to 6 millimeters becomes more active, and hence we can see good for distance. A few things that we need to know is that since it's like creating a multifocality, there is always a slight impact on distance vision, because when we are viewing for distance, then rays are also passing through the central 3 millimeters. And if the pupil is small, for example, in sunlight, there will be more of this impact on distance vision. This is just a single step, because when we talk about multifocality on the cornea, there is always a fear of glare halos and decreased contrast. But in our series, we've hardly seen all these complications. And this is probably because this is just a single step and it's a smooth transition, the single step is different from creating multiple rings on the cornea. So in any evaluation of press by LASIK, counseling becomes a very important part, as it becomes similar to as important it is for implantations. So first thing that we need to explain to the patient is that presbyopia cannot be cured, and whatever we are doing is to decrease the dependence on glasses, and it's a trade-off between the near and the distance vision, because we are making the one eye better for distance and the other eye better for near. Secondly, we need to explain that this is a temporary measure, because it is up to +2 diopters which we are correcting. Hence, the age group that is most ideal for this is 40 to 55 years of age. Beyond this age, say when a patient becomes around 60 and the near vision power is around +3, then also we have corrected 1.75 to +2, because that's our maximum limit. Hence the power would be around +1. So the dependence would be less on glasses compared to what the patient would have had if he had a power of +3. The third thing that we need to look into is if the patient has any lenticular changes, because if there is a cataract there, then it is better to remove the cataract and put a bifocal or a trifocal lens rather than doing a press by LASIK. So in clinical evaluation, since this is a pupil-dependent procedure, checking the pupil size obviously becomes important. There has to be a minimum pupil size, otherwise the effect of supracore would be gone. You also have to check simultaneously if the pupil dilates centrally or eccentrically. If it dilates eccentrically, then again you would have a suboptimal effect. You have to ensure a proper centration. For this, angle kappa has to be kept in mind. If the angle kappa is high, then it is better to not do this procedure, especially in hyperopes where we find that there is a high angle kappa. If it is between 4 to 8, there are certain machines, like for example this Bausch & Lomb Teneo machine, where you can change the aiming beam, and you can move your aiming beam and get it more nasally or temporally, depending upon whatever your angle kappa is. The best results with this press by LASIK are in hyperopes. In hyperopes, we tend to do a bilateral treatment approach, in which the dominant eye is treated with what is called a mild or a soft supracore, where a near add of +1.25 to 1.5 is given. The non-dominant eye is treated with a regular or a standard supracore, where a near add of around +2 is given, which means that the dominant eye is made better for distance and the non-dominant eye is made better for near. In myopia, generally a monolateral treatment approach is taken, where in the dominant eye a simple LASIK is done, and in the non-dominant eye a regular supracore is done. And these are the patients which become happier if you just do a LASIK in one eye and press by LASIK in the other eye. For this, we do a preoperative simulation test, which is a simple test where we put a trial pin, we 0.5, and this simulates the potential blur. And if the patient is happy with this, then we know that this will be a happy patient in the postoperative period. And similarly, we put the plus 1.75 on non-dominant eye and 1.25 on the dominant eye. And if the patient is happy, then we know that this is going to be a happy patient. So, these cases are actually showing similar things where what I've already discussed. So we can skip this since we already have less time. So I would end by saying that a good planning based upon what the refractive error of the patient is will give optimum results in presby LASIK patients, and a good counseling will further enhance these results. And before I leave, a Women Ophthalmologist Society is coming out with a special issue of rare eye diseases, which will come out in early next year. And we all invite your submissions for this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mohita. It's a wonderful talk.
Thank you, Mohita.
So, in continuation of the presbyopic, I think we have my friend Kumar. He'll be talking about the Presbymax, how it works.
Welcome, Dr. Kumar.
So I was happy to see Mohita's presentation, and I've realized that all these biopic treatments are quite dependent on pupil size. And I'm going to add more to it. So the treatment from Schwind is called Presbymax, and we'll just go a little bit into detail as to how it actually works. So here, of course, it's the same thing. Basically, what we do is 3 options. Here, we are trying to treat. So from 2012, we are having this, and this is then going on till 2016. So there has been Presbymax, and this is dependent. This is, of course, on the Schwind platform. It is a biaspheric multifocal corneal treatment. So we are creating biaspheric zones on the surface of the cornea. And first we had micromonovision, then it became hybrid. And today what we have is monocular. So what is the difference between each is what I will show, and how do we apply this to our science. So bottom line here is whether we use any of the systems available in the market today, we have to increase our depth of focus. So when we have a distant dominant eye and a non-dominant eye, this information is very crucial. And if you want to do micromonovision, in the distant dominant eye, we are creating only a 0.9 diopters of depth of focus, while we are creating a 0.9 or a minus 1.8 in the non-dominant eye. In a hybrid pattern of treatment, we are creating even lesser depth of focus in the distant dominant eye. And in monocular, it's just like the Zeiss platform, where one treatment for distant dominant is absolutely no depth of focus, but a minus 1.8 in the non-dominant eye. So we have 3 options on the Schwind platform, which is with the Amaris laser, which is micromonovision, hybrid, or monocular. So all of this is applicable. So this is the depth of difference that we will get in Presbymax. In micromonovision, you can see that the dominant eye, we have more depth of vision, and the non-dominant eye is about minus 1.5. Presbymax hybrid, the dominant eye, as you can see in this chart in the middle row, it reduces. And Presbymax monocular is distant dominant, works entirely for distance, and the non-dominant eye work entirely for near. So it's like a monovision or a monocular vision. The most important thing here, as rightly mentioned even by Mohita, is that you need positive thinking patients. Patients who will be more satisfied. In my practice, I've seen that hyperopes are happy with this kind of treatment, and high astigmatics. Low myopes and myopes in my this thing are not at all happy with Presbymax, because they tend to compare with the normal vision that they have. And again, I say that we are creating a biaspheric surface, which is on the surface of the cornea. Very important that these patients do have a trial with contact lenses which are multifocal. So in multifocal contact, if you are doing micromonovision, we target for a -1 residual myopia in the non-dominant eye, which is your near eye, and a target distance for 0 for distance, which is in your dominant eye. So you have a medium at power in both distances for distance and near. So this is micromonovision. In hybrid, of course, it's little lower than what we did in micromonovision. And monocular is entirely like a dominant and a non-dominant. The dominant eye works for distance and the non-dominant eye works for near. All of this, of course, we are going to create asphericity on the surface of the cornea, which gives additional depth. But the summary of all of this is the pupil size. So this treatment, like rightly mentioned by Dr. Mohita, is also pupil dependent. So you are creating actually a refractive surface on the cornea. The pupil in photopic light conditions should be 3.5 maximum. And in mesopic or scotopic conditions should be minimum 4.5. If this does not match, the patient is not fit for this treatment. So it's very important that we give a contact lens trial, make sure that the patient is happy, look at the pupil size in different conditions, and then only go ahead and do the treatment if possible. Even the optical zone selection is dependent on the size of the pupil, which we always do. So here the pupil background, we have different ways of measuring. We can use either a Cirrus platform or a Primaris, or I use a wavefront analyzer to get the exact pupil size. And then this treatment, once we get the pupil diameter, either photopic or scotopic, that is taken in. So overall view, this is a summary that there are inclusion criteria. Of course, there are exclusion criteria like any other ocular pathology, and treatment planning. Just a little bit about the treatment planning. This is a very simple chart from Schwind. If the patient is anisometropia tolerant of more than 1 diopter and is not tolerant at all, then there is no treatment possible for that patient. But if your photopic pupil is 2.5 and 3.5, your scotopic pupil is 4.5, the acceptance is increased to recover in multiple. So I'm going down the chart, and yes, then it's moderate to high. Patient will be happy with Presbymax hybrid or Presbymax monovision. So this is a simple chart that has to be followed, and the patient will be quite happy with the treatment. So most important, patients have to be motivated, and we have to make sure that their side effects, you should have a contact lens trial. Once the contact lens trial should be there at least for a week. We normally give it for a week. And of course, we check the pupil size, the optical zone, and there is a lot of chair time that is included. Here, very important is the treatment, how it goes. Just the Presbymax, this is how it goes. And the optical zone is selected again according to the pupil size. So you can see that presbyopic myopia, the optical zone is smaller, but presbyopic hyperopia, the optical zone gets larger. If there is more astigmatism, the optical zone will get even larger. So you can go till 7 millimeters optical zone. This is just the way the whole chart really looks. You can see that the presby in the center is 1.75. Your option of micro monovision, hybrid or monocular, that's on the right hand side. And you can feed in the data that is there. And the near data, of course, you have to treat for near depending on what the patient is actually accepting. The best part of this treatment is that it is reversible. Let us say that we take this, there is a lot of neuroadaptation. I don't know, my patients find sometimes between 1 month to 4 months to adapt to this kind of vision. I don't know what is Mohita's experience, but they do find. But the good part here is that it is reversible. So this is the OD treatment that you can see. And this is the format that you see in the dominant eye and the non-dominant eye. So if the patient is unhappy and we have treated a plus 2.25, we can do a minus 2.25 treatment in the non-dominant eye and reverse the whole asphericity that we have created on the surface of the cornea. So the biaspheric surface, that means the center for near and the periphery for reading, can be corrected and the patient can go back to like a normal LASIK treatment. So this is a reversal platform as to how it will actually look on the ablation depth profile. Of course, important to get all your data very, very well. The cycloplegia is subject to acceptance and all the rest of the treatment has to be looked at. So in my experience, hyperopes are very happy between the age of 46 and 50. High astigmatics are happy, but I'm not happy with myopes and low myopes because they tend to compare with the normal vision, myopic vision that they are already having. They're short-sighted. They want that kind of sharp vision in presbyopic, which is not possible. So this is my experience with the Presbyon. And don't forget, friends, at least Schwind is charging us for every treatment. So what I have found that the treatment lasts for about 3 years to 4 years and they need a retreatment. And Schwind will charge you again for a retreatment. And if there is a retreatment in 1 year, they're going to charge you again in 1 year. So this is one thing. And I feel cornea modulates over time. And that's the reason why if you see that steepening that is occurring in the center over 3 years, 4 years, it really doesn't last so long. This is my experience. Of course, you have stalwarts here like Kudlu, Sonu, and the rest of you. What is your experience? And Dr. Sukando can also please add to this.
Can I ask the question, Dr. Sonu? Dr. Kumar, I wanted to ask you.
Go ahead.
What's the basic principle? Is it similar to Supracor for Presbymax? This is also a central steepening treatment?
Yes.
Central steepening. Okay.
It's like a refractive surface on the surface of the cornea, not a diffractive. So it's that's why it's pupil dependent.
So
thank you, Kumar.
You think
Yeah, Mohita, please.
A little larger size for the pupil, because I thought if the how much is the central steepening? What area is it?
0.9.
Patients are happy.
I've not really measured it, but it's around 0.9. So you can see it on the topography that, yeah.
So with 0.9, with the pupil size of 3.5, would it not interfere with the reading? Because normally in SupraCore, we keep the minimum cutoff for pupil size as somewhere around 2.5. So I thought 3.5 was a little larger. Maybe that's why I was asking how much.
So if it is, that's the upper limit. Hello?
So I think, hello, yeah, Kumar, we can hear you.
Yeah. So we have found excellent results in hyperopia. I personally feel hyperopics are very happy because they anyway get depth. We are creating prolicity in the center anyway. And this gets added on by our presbyopic treatment. So they are even more happy.
And did you do any emetropic eyes?
No. Patients are not happy with emetropia in our platform.
Full screen.
Fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumar, for that wonderful talk. Dr. Rajan, are you ready with the presentation?
Yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah, please
Hello.
go ahead.
Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, you're audible and your slides are visible.
Okay. First of all, I'm highly thankful to All India Ophthalmic Society for giving me an opportunity to give my talk on topoguided LASIK, which is my approach to laser vision correction in borderline corneas. Whenever a patient of refractive surgery walks into a clinic, first of all, we should know the various selection criteria for the patient. So, patient of myopia can be treated by PRK up to -5 diopters. LASIK, we can treat up to -8 diopters. In hyperopic patients, we can treat up to +2.5 diopters by PRK, and by LASIK up to +4 diopter or spherical equivalent. In astigmatic patients, we can treat by PRK up to 2.5 diopter cylinder, and by LASIK up to 4 diopters of the cylinder. So various limitations of the laser vision correction are: center corneal thickness should be more than 470 microns for PRK. It should be more than 490 microns for cases for LASIK, and residual stromal thickness after PRK should be more than 400 microns with epi-on and more than 300 microns for the LASIK patients. The refractive error we can treat -8 diopter spherical to +4 diopter spherical, and percentage tissue alteration should be less than 40%, and keratometry should be from 39 diopter to 48 diopters. So let's have a case study of a patient which entered into my clinic, which was a female, 24 years of age, which has the manifest refraction of -6 diopter spherical with -2 diopter cylinder at 180 degree, and the mean keratometry was 42.7 diopters, and pachymetry was 500 microns. I choose for a flap of 90 microns. So it was borderline cornea, but I can do it. How? What first was to which procedure to choose from? I prefer to choose LASIK, a thin flap LASIK with the LASIK or topoguidal LASIK laser over PRK. Why not PRK? It's just because of post-operative pain, the late visual recovery, and the risk of haze in high refractive errors. So should I go for a standard LASIK or topoguided LASIK? The important things to notice for the refractive patient: the residual stromal thickness after 90 to 100 microns of flap should be around 300 microns, and the patient should have a normal topography. In the standard treatment, the basis is based on the keratometry, the pachymetry, and the refractive prescription of the patient. It corrects the sphere and the cylinder component only, and it's a good option for patients having the normal topography. The TopoLine offers the unique capability that provides the surgeons a greater degree of individual personalization. This procedure is redefining the term, the quality of vision, proving that many patients experience better vision than they ever did with glasses or contact lenses. So topoguided treatment offers us a basket of choices. In topoguided LASIK, we can correct the refractive error based on the topography of the cornea, centering the ablation profile on the visual axis for the better visual recovery, and maintaining the asphyxia of the cornea along with the reduced depth of ablation. Otherwise, we can also have the smoothing procedure of the anterior corneal surface along with or without refractive error correction. So the principal elements for the topoguided LASIK is the assessment of topography and centering the ablation on the visual axis. So a topo-guided platform provided by the ZEISS, it has three components. That is the Atlas Corneal Topographer, the CRS Master software, and we can do procedure on MEL 80 or MEL 90 excimer lasers. So the patient's eye is imaged and analyzed unique elevation points on the cornea on Atlas Topographer, and the Atlas data is sent to the CRS Master to create a customized ablation profile, which allows the combination of standard and topographic laser surgery. So the preview on the topographic CRS Master, that is the planning station, you can see a orange cross which depicts the pupillary center. It determines the center of the optical zone and it represents the anatomical center. And the green cross represents the corneal apex position and it's close to the visual axis and it corresponds to the manifest refraction. The pupil to ring center distance represents topographically derived angle kappa. So in the treatment planning, that we import to the topography to the CRS Master, enter the other parameters of the patients. The ablation, topo-guided ablation principle is that the ablation starts from the highest point of the irregularity of the corneal surface. So important thing to notice for it, a perfect topographic measurement is a precondition for a successful topo-guided laser treatment. Inaccurate or unreliable data from the topography will lead to an inaccurate treatment of the patient. So the excimer laser automatically adjusts the laser pulses to match topo-guided planning software. And so what else we can do with the topo-guided treatment? We can treat corneal irregularity, the optic zone enlargement, the decenter ablations, the flap complications, the corneal haze, and the irregular astigmatism. So the indication for the topography smooth is eyes that cannot be well corrected with the glasses or contact lenses and have irregularities and splittage in the corneal surface with inconsistent refraction. The ablation profile is based on the topography map only. It's a two-step approach, creating regular cornea. Later, we correct the refraction with standard SCA treatment with a higher safety and the predictability for the patient. So customization by topo-guided planning offers us a tissue-saving solution. The clearly reduced depth of the ablation is a major benefit, in particular also for the secondary treatments. So topo-guided treatment is a leap forward. Its proven clinical results show improvement in uncorrected visual acuity with the best corrected visual acuity and excellent visual acuity outcomes. The clinical results indicate statistically significant improvement in contrast sensitivity and improved control of lower order aberrations and correcting the topographical irregularities. So in summary, the topo-guided glasses, it provides us the correction of refractive error based on topography and the ablation of visual axis for the better visual quality, and it maintains this asphericity of cornea along with the reduced depth of ablation. And it provides us the smoothing of anterior corneal surface with or without the refractive error correction. And it is good for secondary treatment for decentered ablation, small optical zones, central islands, flap complications, the corneal haze, and the irregular astigmatism. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan Gupta.
Thank you, Dr. Rajan. So
yes,
now we have our own scientific committee member, Dr. KP Kudlu, and I request him to talk on Presbyon. Over to you, KP.
Thank you, Sonu. Am I visible, my slides?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I think I was very much interested to hear the talks from Mohita and Kumar, how exactly the other two systems work, SupraCore and the PresbyMax. Same like how Kumar said that this treatment is also quite similar to that, except for this is not depend upon the pupil size. This is my financial disclosure. So there are few principles to correct presbyopia, as in the previous speaker said that you can do monovision by correcting one eye for distance and the other eye for near, or you can even create a multifocality in the cornea. Some of the excimer treatment does, or even people tried with increased depth of focus by implanting corneal inlays in the non-dominant eye. So what exactly this how exactly this Presband works? It is a combination of micro monovision and increased depth of focus with the help of examiner system, either MEL 80 or MEL 90, with a special software system provided by the Carl Zeiss, that is CRS Master. So these are the few principles behind laser blended vision: monovision principle, depth of field to reduce anisometropia, spherical aberration control, vertex centration, multifocality, and also neural sublimation, blur adaptation, and in the end, neural suppression. So what exactly we do, we make the dominant eye emmetropic and make the non-dominant eye myopic by 1.5 diopters. And the blend zone is the zone where exactly the vision from the dominant and the non-dominant eye meets up and binocular retains. We not only we do the dominant eye emmetropic, non-dominant eye myopic, we also create a control spherical aberration in both the cornea. This is very important. So creating a controlled aberration in both the very, very important. So coming to why we did not pick the other two system like multifocal treatment, because brain tend to suppress certain blur from one eye to the other eye. These are the few problems with the other treatment we faced before. A lot of my friends used to do, because of patient used to take a lot of time to adapt. Also, you have to do sometimes a repeated treatment, which is sometimes patient may not be agree. Even there is a loss of distance vision by one line for some of the patients. And of course, multifocal treatment, definitely I have been doing in a big number. Today morning, my pal said they also telling that lens-based procedure is the best procedure. But still, there are some problems with this multifocal IOLs, especially glare and halos, and some amount of decrease in the contrast sensitivity. Why we pick this particular treatment with micromonovision? Brain tend to suppress certain blur from the one eye to the other eye. So basically, this is a bilateral treatment. Always we tell the patient to open their both the eyes. Binocular vision will be always sharper than the monocular vision. For example, dominant eye, if you tell them to read straight, they'll read 6/6 spot. But if you tell them to open both the eyes and read straight, then they'll be seeing the much sharper vision. As my friend Dan always say that 97% of the patient actually accept this treatment. Basically, it's a bilateral approach. Of course, it's very important in nowadays, as everybody was telling, the presbyopia is going to be the market in the refractive surgery. We have to keep eye on. Nowadays, lot of people, everybody is with this computer work, mobile gadgets, especially age more than 40 years, they don't want to wear the glasses. Definitely, they are coming to us. Probably this month itself, I have done at least minimum of 10 presbyon. These are the few of the patients, 300 patients, 600 eyes. Now, I do it even at the age of 39 if they are already started to develop a presbyopia. Till my patients are till 55. This study shows that much. Even I have done for patients with 60 years. Of course, I make sure that patient doesn't have any cataract with the help of eye trace by seeing the dysfunctional lens index. So in my studies, most of the patients are myopes are very happy. 145 patients, hyperopia around 75 patients, and even I do it in emmetropic patient. You can see here at least almost around 30 patient emmetropia, and patient did very well. This is normally what we do: the target refraction, dominant eye plano, and the non-dominant eye between 1.25 to 1.75. This is the range. Normally I adjust for a young patient, I keep it 1.25. For elder patient around 52 years, I go up to 1.75. So 1.75 plus amount of spherical aberration, it will come to, they'll get the effect of around 2.25 to 2.5 to the eye. So this is the standard LASIK procedure now we are doing with the microkeratome also. So who can undergo presbyon any presbyopic age? So myopia up to 8 diopters depending upon the Pachy value, hypermetropia up to 5 diopters depending upon the corneal thickness. We have done in emmetropia, even astigmatism up to 4 diopters we have tried, but make sure that patient doesn't have the cataract. Of course, as Dr. Mohita said, that refraction is very important. Always I do cycloplegic refraction in all my patients. Dominant testing will be done by myself, and micromonovision testing also done by myself only. So then once you do everything, the whole CRS master plan, the treatment, you have to take it in your pen drive. So the new treatment now, you can even ability to include the functional age in the coming treatment. I'll skip the video. These are our results. But what I felt in out of 300 eyes, none of the eyes lost more than half Snellen's line of vision when compared to preoperative corrected distance visual acuity. And majority of the patient maintain stereo acuity and no loss of contrast sensitivity. This is our results. These are the advantage with this treatment, which is not depend upon the pupil size. You can do a wide range of refractive error, very good intermediate vision in all my patients with a good near vision, with no significant night vision problem and contrast changes. According to me, probably the best and the safest presbyopic treatment available. Thank you, Anand.
Thank you, KP, for that wonderful talk. And it looks as if we all should now move into this presbyopic correction, looking from, hearing from all you stalwarts. So we have next stalwart, Dr. Amrish Darak, and he'll be talking on, again, one of the methods for correction, suprachor. And Dr. Amrish is a high volume refractive surgeon, a pioneer and a leading refractive surgeon and a good friend. So Amrish, all to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. And I would like to congratulate Scientific Committee for organizing such a complex show so beautifully. So I'm very happy last 3-4 years, major importance has been given to this presbyopic laser treatment. A special mention is happening in every conference about this. So this actually is a new horizon which has opened up. So many of my speakers have already spoken about it.
These slides are not changing. Huh?
Yeah.
So just single click on your screen, then you can move your slides.
Yeah. So suprachor, again, I'll be talking about suprachor. I won't talk about the basic principle. It's just creating a central 3 mm bump. So that works center for near kind of thing. And hyperpositive area is created in the center to help for a near vision. So Dr. Mohita has already covered the principle, the mechanism of action and everything about the suprachor. And other two platforms has been covered by Dr. Kumar and Dr. Kudlu. So I would like to mention basic, once you know the mechanism of action of your laser platform, any presbyopic treatment will require a customization as per the need of the patient. So know your machine better, know how it works, and then you have to modify every time. Whenever, don't go by simple principle, add this, deduct this, do this. No, you have to work out. You have to spend time with your patient, understand his needs, understand what he is actually looking for, and then plan your treatment. Once you know the principle, then you can do it very well. So bilateral treatment, initially the company suggests to go for unilateral, then principally everybody suggests do the non-dominant eye. But yes, the suprachor or any presbyopic correction can be done bilaterally once you know about the thing. So detailed history, I won't be discussing again in detail because most of the time whenever you are treating presbyopic laser, these things are mandatory. Do whatever principle of LASIK, whatever tests are required when you do LASIK, the same things, the same investigation and evaluation is required for these treatments. So I will just skip these few of the slides and I'll directly jump to the cases. So you have already seen how the simulation test and everything has been given. Be clear what you are offering to your patient. Let them know what exactly they'll be seeing post-operatively. And then you get a satisfied patient. So basically, default refractive target for suprachor is not plano, but 0.5. So you can enhance the effect to get around 2 diopter of addition to central near zone. Hyperopic, as Dr. Kumar rightly said, hyperopic patients are more satisfied with the outcomes compared to myope. But if you work out your strategy better, then even your myopes are happy. I have good experience of almost 400 patients I have done presbyopic treatment, and I can very well now say I am a suprachor patient. I have undergone presbyopic laser, and it's almost more than 4 years now, and I'm still say 6'6" and 6", which defines a very good role. So if you choose the treatment rightly, if you plan the treatment rightly, you get a good results. As Dr. Kumar said, regression up to 0.5, yes, the usual flattening efforts in next 2 to 3 years. So whenever you plan the treatment, keep in mind these factors also and modify your treatment accordingly. I have done suprachor in pseudophakic also, and comparatively these people have lesser expectations, and even if they improve up to N8, it's a very good thing for them because at that age, that thing actually helps them to have a good phakic, say good near vision. So I'll discuss this case. This is a 44 years old auditor, keeps forgetting to carry and wear spectacles. So basically he had plus hyperop plus 2.5 and 2 diopter with right eye dominance. So again, as planned, we did a supracore in both the eyes. The mesopic pupil size and photopic pupil size is already mentioned. He was comfortable with the near trial, but not for the distance, except monovision on simulation. So the pre-treatment calculation was this way. Second case is a journalist with a subjective refractor around 2.5 diopter and 3.5 diopter, taking addition of 1.5 at 90. So near needs glasses for near, early onset presbyopia. Both patients were treated bilateral supracore treatment with supracore major and minor. So non-dominant eye, you correct for plus 2 diopter, and non-dominant eye, dominant eye, you correct for 1.5 diopter. So this is the treatment calculation. And the post-operative result, uncorrected visual acuity was 6.9 and N8. So yes, while treating hyperopic patient, you have to keep in mind the angle kappa. If the angle kappa is high, yes, don't do the patient. Don't operate this patient. This is another example of 55 years actor, subjective refraction, taking addition of 2 and right eye dominance. So treatment modality, again, supracore mild was offered to dominant eye and supracore regular for left eye. You must have come across the kind of calculation and changes done in the refractive correction while feeding the treatment for these patients. This is a redo LASIK kind of thing. So LASIK in 2005, very happy, almost 6.6 for 8 years, came with a presbyopic correction of plus 2. And he started multifocal treatment for presbyopia. So we treated this patient, again the same, because of light colored iris, we couldn't lift that flap. So we again, this example, the relifting of flap was done and the regular supracore in non-dominant eye was done in this case. So the patient, non-dominant, was 6.9 N6. Patient was very happy post-operatively. So post-LASIK also, we can go for supracore or any presbyopic correction as required. Proper evaluation and counseling is important in these cases.
Thank you so much, Dr. Derek.
Thank you, Tarak. It was a fantastic talk. Of course, we could be able to cover the presbyopia. It's up to the patient call to select the option, whether it's Presby Max, whether it's Presbyon or Supracore. Almost all the treatment, it works almost same. Once again, I thank the chairpersons, Dr. Kumar, and Dr. Anand, Dr. Shamant, and all the other panelists for this wonderful cooperation. This session really went on really well.
Thank you, Kudlu. And thank you, Sonu, and everybody.
So,
Thank you. I think, in fact, we should be thankful to you for sparing time and pouring in your knowledge. Thank you, Kumar. Thank you, Amrish. Thank you, all the speakers and the chair and the